Hey everyone, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us at our YouTube channel. Please leave your comments in the sections below and we'll get to them on some upcoming episodes. So welcome back, everybody. Today we are joined by Kavin, who is another member of the ScholarAI engineering team. Lakshay, why don't you tee us up with Kavin?
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, welcome Kavin. He's a founding scientist on the team. He's a PhD from Duke. Having studied ML, I'll let him do the more formal intro of himself. But Kavin, how about you go ahead, tell the audience where you're from, kind of your background, how you ended up at ScholarAI.
Yeah, so I'm from Jersey, went to college, Princeton, did electrical engineering, was very interested in kind of like AI and robotics through my undergrad. Ended up doing a lot of research and kind of realized that academia was more interesting to me and I wanted to get a deep understanding of the things I found interesting. Ended up going to Duke for a PhD. I studied with Dr. Michael Zavlanos. He was mostly into optimization and controls. And then AI was starting to kind of pick up by the time I joined. And a few of the students before me were starting to do research in that area. So it was a natural kind of transition for the entire lab to start looking into learning and agents. So I did my PhD in reinforcement learning and robotics, was very interested in multi-agent systems and kind of how agents work together. Ended up defending last year. And kind of along the way, I ended up getting into venture capital and working with Duke Capital Partners, which is how I know Damon. And Damon kind of brought me onto ScholarAI and been having a great time since.
How's, obviously, like with AI, LLMs, like AI is kind of, at least in the time that I've been an engineer, has always kind of been like a growingly hot topic, kind of associated with like how big data was growing as a topic. But in your view, obviously AI has been a thing, like people have been using AI for a very long time, but it's entered the vernacular for a lot of people just because of what ChatGPT is. What is your general outlook on like the AI space, LLM separated versus like conventional like product? You have experience in robotics. Like where do you see that going in particular the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think LLMs kind of forced everyone to pause and try to think about how to actually use it in whatever they were doing. I feel like when they came out initially, it was super interesting, but then only until like GPT did people really start to think about how can I actually integrate this into whatever I'm doing. So I think for the next few months, maybe even like the next year, you're going to have a lot of even like robotics companies and other companies in tech trying to find some way of using LLMs. So I was talking to someone who works at Chef Robotics, and they were talking about how venture capitalists right now are just asking every startup, like, how are you using AI? So even companies that are using more traditional controls-based approaches, and they're getting very good accuracy with those approaches, are still being asked, like, how are you using AI? So I think, companies, whether or not they actually want to bring in AI, I think they're going to have to consider the optics and how AI kind of fits into their strategy and long-term growth. But I think it's a good thing. I think that LLMs are actually more powerful than we thought. Myself included, when they first came out, I was like, oh, okay, cool. This just seems like a large model. Obviously it's powerful, but there's been papers of roboticists using LLMs to help train four-legged robots to balance on exercise balls, which is a very difficult controls problem. But LLMs were able to kind of solve one particular piece in between, which was how do you design this reward function? And so usually that's human design, but bringing in LLMs kind of enabled them to figure out what the right parameters for that problem was.
What do you think, how are you feeling about the general space of these robotics companies? Of course, Elon just mentioned a couple of days ago that not mentioned explicitly, but there's going to be a higher focus on Tesla as like a robotics company rather than kind of an EV company. How do you feel about the product consumer AE space? Like, where do you think the future of robotics is going in the next 5 years? Obviously, LLMs is making its big stride right now. Robotics being hot, seeing a lot of startups in there. Where do you think the future of that is realistically?
Yeah, that's funny because I also saw news that Elon wanted Tesla to invest into XAI and kind of make Tesla more AI conscious, which is funny because, they're a self-driving car company. And so then the question is, how does AI kind of come in there? But it kind of goes back to this point of AI is hot, and people kind of know that with the hype cycle, you need AI somewhere in, those buzzwords that you're kind of tossing around. In terms of the future of robotics, I think that, there's robotics foundational models, I think are kind of hot right now. So they're essentially, an equivalent to these large language models. When you have these general models for NLP, and they can kind of take in a lot of input and answer very sarcastic and general questions, people have been thinking, how can we replicate this in robotics? And so rather than trying to train individual models for specific robots, the question is, why can't we have one general robot model that can take in different input, video, audio, maybe even tactile, and then be able to output some type of general, policy. Obviously, depending on the actual motors or the joints of that robot, that final action space is going to be different. But having some central module that can basically be transferable and basically can be almost plug and play, I think is kind of like the idea behind people working on those robotics foundational models. And there's been companies like Skilled AI, and I know Figure AI, like they're trying to build these very general robotics. One of the questions I have is more on the economics of it. If you're trying to build, an actual hardware for this robot, where exactly are you going to put it, right? Like you spend maybe $500,000 on this very intelligent robot. Are you going to put it into a warehouse? Like there are simpler robots that can do that job. Are you going to put it in the military where anything can go wrong and all of a sudden your robot can be annihilated? So there's interesting questions here in terms of what is the right product market fit for building these very advanced robots, like these humanoid robots. There's another side to it, which I think is, just pushing the frontier and being the first company to actually get there. Obviously we have like OpenAI, Meta, Mistral. Like I think everyone is trying to fight to be the face of AI. But we don't really know who the face of robotics is. And so Boston Dynamics has kind of been that face for the past few years. DeepMind's been kind of coming in a little bit. But right now there's kind of that vacancy purely because LLMs kind of have shown us that there's a higher threshold that we can reach possibly with robotics. So part of me kind of thinks that a lot of these companies are trying to just get there because they want to be the face of robotics. And part of this also, you see a lot of like these very well-known scientists, right, who are kind of leading these companies, who have achieved a lot in academia already. And so now it's kind of like, what's the next frontier? And it's being, if you think of robotics, it's like, cool, we want to be that company that people think of.
Kevin, I have a question about models as you see them, as someone who's studied in this space and has kind of an insider view. How much better do you think these general purpose large language models can get? We've seen expanded context windows. We've seen better use of hardware and lots of data clusters. Is the progress that's remaining now incremental, or do you think there are still major step changes ahead for the general purpose large language model?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I know the exact answer to that, but I'll kind of just speak my thoughts. I think there's two ways that, where improvements could be made. So one is within the actual large language model architecture. Right now, everyone's using transformers, but there's been work into state-space models and other types of models. So there could be improvement by switching to a different type of architecture. And then there's also improvement where it's relevant to compute. And basically, if you have access to more compute, it means you can have larger context window and just do more things generally. So to kind of answer that question, it seems like as compute gets better and better, you're obviously going to have these large language transformer-based models get better and better. But if you're looking for specific, like maybe a 10x, 20x gain, I feel like that's probably more so in an architecture change. So there's companies that are already kind of trying out alternative architectures. So like Liquid AI is one of those, using more like liquid neural nets. But I think that there's still a lot of work I think that has to go into using those models. And there's also this interesting idea of like democracy when you kind of switch to different architectures. So transformer-based architectures are very prevalent. It's very, I would say at this point, very open source. People know even if you don't have an ML background, you can kind of go learn what a transformer architecture is, and you can basically kind of almost recreate it. And state-based models, I feel like, are still very much in academia. They're very difficult to understand. You need to have that type of technical kind of background to understand and work with. So there's this idea of how transformer-based architecture is very democratic, but in the case that, it ends up being a different architecture that wins out, are we going to see that same type of democracy with those type of models? Are they going to be as easily accessible as the transformer architectures have been? So in one way, you kind of hope, obviously, that models get faster and better. But then on the other, you want still these models to be democratic so that everyone basically has access to them and they're not kind of behind some very large paywall.
How do you see edge computing, Kavin? Do you see a significant step change in models, whether they're small models or maybe mid-sized models, moving toward edge computing? And how do you see that potentially creating more use cases or more access to models where maybe people are reluctant to use models? Perhaps it's for privacy concerns or something else, or speed.
Yeah, so I think I feel like I've been seeing in the news a lot, just smaller models being put on phones and trying to be put on phones. So I know recently Samsung has been trying to push more AI-based phones and trying to be the leader there. I think smaller models definitely will be very useful. So we already have, I think Internet of Things a decade ago was a very hot topic. And I think now smaller models kind of fits into that paradigm really well, where you have, these smartwatches, you have maybe smart heater, cooler systems, smartphones, whatever. Obviously, the smaller the model you can get that still works, like this would be great. But the question then becomes also, what are these small models really used for, right? And if you think of large language models as you want to be able to take any type of generic input and have a coherent, good answer. A lot of these smaller things like heater, cooler, like they have a set amount of things that they have to do. So I feel like, more so anything that could be a smartphone, I think will benefit from these smaller models. So maybe like Apple Watches, smartphones, like those 100%, you're going to have different types of multimodal input. But I think it might be hard to kind of fit something as powerful as these smaller models on smaller gadgets that just might not need that extra type of thinking.
I think one thing I want to pull on there, Kavin, with you a little bit is this idea that a general purpose model, whether it be a large language model or whatever, kind of emerges beyond that. Is this underlying idea that there is a worldview that can be created in a way that is machine readable, right? So with language models, the central premise is that effectively information can be represented as language, right? You or I can describe to each other the information that exists in a PDF or the actions that need to be taken to, lift a box onto a shelf in an Amazon warehouse or something like that. And so I'm just curious if you see the evolution of models, assuming there is something, do you think they will still use world models that are based on language, or can you see other elements of something perhaps supplementing the language, or, do you see it kind of alternatively?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So my immediate thought, I don't know if this is the direct answer to your question, but my immediate thought is I would be worried if they use something that wasn't human interpretable, mostly because, we always want models to be interpretable, to understand what's going on in this black box. Language is obviously a way for humans to understand concepts. So there might be some other type of method through which these models might have better encoding, or it's easier to fit in information through a different type of paradigm. But as long as it's interpretable, I think as long as it's interpretable by humans, I think that's fine. The other point to which your question kind of got me to was recently, about 2 days ago, there was this paper released where researchers used LLMs in Minecraft. And so when you mentioned kind of this worldview, Minecraft is basically the video game version of that. And so I haven't taken a deep dive into the paper yet, but just taking a skim, it looks like they're using an LLM to kind of train these agents. They're able to kind of build skills in the real world and actually do a lot of things that aren't just pure tasks, but they're able to also like explore and do more, things that you would expect in this type of free world environment, rather than just a set number of tasks. So obviously the real world is a lot more complex than Minecraft. But I think it does go to show that language does go at least some distance in trying to, understand what the real world is. I think one of the bigger problems right now is just vision-based models. Because if you're really trying to move away from language, right, images and video obviously encode a lot more information. There's still things that are like difficult for models to do in terms of like few shot learning, right? Where it's like, cool, maybe they've trained on a lot of pedestrians or humans, but if you don't have like a bike in your training set, then and this has happened with like self-driving cars before. And another question, I was actually talking to someone who used to work at Neuro, which is a self-driving car company, and they were saying that it's hard to even think about what does that training process look like when you're trying to build this overall type of vision model. Like what images go into your training set? How are you labeling everything? So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I'm by no means an expert, but I think obviously we would love to have other types of input along with language, but I think we're still getting there.
I mean, I just find it fascinating. I've been thinking about this quite a lot lately, in that if we use the analogy of humans and the ways that we kind of interpret the things around us, you can think about language models as being kind of the ears, so to speak. They're kind of, I'm saying they're taking in text, they're taking in information and some of that. You think about vision models as being the eyes. I do kind of wonder, back to the robotics question, what becomes, the other types of receptors, mechanoreceptors, taste receptors, those other kinds of chemoreceptors that are not necessarily visual stimulus, but that is, and I think about language in the form of auditory. I suppose auditory or red is kind of similar, but I do wonder mechanical, taste, smell, those kind of things, in which, to kind of have a truly, close to sentient, AI, I suppose you're probably going to need all types of inputs, or at least, probably more than what we've gotten to now. So, it's fun to speculate, I think, especially with, relevance to Tesla and, Figure and other robotics companies.
Yeah, I think we kind of almost forget that we've had a very powerful model when it comes to sound, which is like, Shazam, SoundCloud, like these types of models that can take in just beats and music and then be able to, tell you what song that is. So obviously, they weren't using LLMs back when they made it, but kind of just goes to show that we've been doing this, or we've always been curious about taking in different types of input and seeing if we can build a model around it. The question is just which of those inputs give us the most information, and then which ones, obviously have a lot of difficulty training. And right now it seems to be vision and images.
I've also been fascinated with the idea lately of taking vision models and using them as proxies for other environmental or real world sensors. So basically, if you use the sensor as kind of whatever sensor exists, to think about like, I don't know, a thermometer or something. This is probably a terrible example, but just follow me for a moment here. If you take vision and some other combination of artificial intelligence models, you can interpret the air and other things, visual aspects of it, that kind of thing, and then relate that to effectively labeled data that is coming out of the other sensors. I do wonder if that can serve as a proxy for expanded trained data sets that are not actual synthetic data, but that are coming from other things. So effectively kind of eventually eliminating the need for that third party sensor, because you can just show a vision model, what it looks like outside, and maybe it can, maybe temperature's a bad example, but use something like, I don't know, air quality index or something like that, to where it maybe has a visual aspect. So something that I've been fascinated with is this idea of how do you use these lower cost software only based models to replace what are otherwise expensive and hard to manipulate hardware sensors.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually a similar question to what you see with kind of agentic training, especially a lot in what I saw in reinforcement learning, where, you always have to figure out what your observation space is for your agent. And, it's easy to just say, okay, cool, I want it to be an image or I want it to be video. But, obviously training on like very complex data can be, it can be very hard to train a model. So a lot of the times you're saying, okay, cool, I want to just define my observation space to be some set number of metrics that, I can measure through other ways. Right. And this kind of goes back to your thermometer analogy, where maybe I'm just measuring temperature as like a value rather than an image of a thermometer. And so people have already been trying to, basically encode information that you could see in an image just through numbers and other metrics. But obviously, sometimes the question then becomes, how do you know you're encompassing all of the information needed for this to be the best model? A lot of times, that choice is by humans. So it kind of comes down to one of the factors is images kind of don't leave out anything. And basically they're, what you see is what you get, rather than having to decompose some of those elements in the image and put them into this vector.
Just to change gears a little bit, anybody watching the Paris Olympics? Anything you're looking forward to? Soccer, swimming, gymnastics?
I think basketball for me.
Yeah. Who's on the team this year? Is it still like a pro basketball team, or is it college kids?
I think it's Braun as captain, and then they brought whoever was good. So KD, Steph, AD, Joel Embiid, Anthony Edwards. Yeah, everyone's in.
And Cooper Flagg's on the team, right?
No, he was invited for the scrims.
Okay.
Preseason, yep. But he was the only high school, college kid invited, I think.
Nice. I hear he did really well in the scrimmage.
Yeah, he was. He actually balled out. I'm pretty sure at one point Anthony Davis was guarding him, and he yelled out mismatch. So he's obviously got a lot of confidence. So love to see it. And
Nice.
I'm looking for
swagger.
I usually don't follow Duke basketball too closely. I think the only season I really followed it was when Zion was there. But I'll probably follow it, this season just because of Cooper.
Were you here when Zion was here, Kevin?
Yeah, that was my first year.
Yeah. I missed it by 1 year. So we came just after he had left. So we kind of missed that whole thing. I am hoping that Cooper Flagg captures a little bit of the magic that I'm sure was here when Zion was here. I don't think it's going to be quite the kind of national phenomena, but pretty excited for, the season.
Is Messi playing in the Olympics? Is he on the team?
No, I think he just finished playing the Copa America, which they won. So I think he's taking a break. I think Olympics, especially for soccer, are usually just more young guys. And I think the rules state that you can have 2 players that are over age. So they brought, Argentina brought Otamendi, who's an experienced defender. I don't know who the other person they brought is, but they actually lost to Morocco 2-1. There was a lot of controversy there.
Oh, wow.
Kind of shifting back away from Olympics, the AI world. So Google just announced that one of their AIs is competing at almost a silver medalist standing in the, I'm going to quote this, International Mathematical Olympiad. So again, just another progress of what they're doing.
As you started whining, it was what sport are I about to say? What kind of sport? Is there be a shot put or something? It's a cannon.
The robots solving sports does feel inevitable. I mean, there's been a golf robot for a long time that effectively is better than any human player. So it does feel like tennis or something in which the mechanics can be fairly easily simulated could be done. Yeah. Basketball feels pretty hard because lugging it around, soccer also hard. It could feel like a baseball tracking robot that was designed to hit home runs would probably be pretty reasonable. And obviously mechanical pitching machines have been around for decades. So it does feel like there's some room to expand there. But no, this was for all intents and purposes, keyboard based sports. So
sorry. Yeah. At least with the Math Olympiad, it does feel to me that is also something where if you look at from a very, very high level, the folks who are very, very good at it, of course, they're very, very talented mathematicians, but a lot of those problems, again, I have a friend who was in the Math Olympiad and was very, very successful and won internationally. And the sort of sense I garner is that those sort of competitions, every problem is a decomposition of patterns. So if you're building a model that's specifically trained on these questions and answers, I would assume that the larger the model gets, the more implicitly those patterns are understood. So it makes sense that it becomes very solvable, even ignoring how well does your program calculate logic beyond that point.
Just to change topics a little bit, what do you make of tech founders moving to Texas? It seems like Elon kind of started this trend, and I've seen several others on Twitter saying they're leaving California and moving to Texas. It seems like part of that was taxes, but taxes have been high in California for a while. and now it feels like it's just a basic rule of law, not having your house invaded, having kind of stores that aren't being looted by shoplifters en masse. Any takes on that?
I think definitely people are starting to go ahead.
Oh,
I was going to say, I think people are starting to realize that, there's just a lot of innovation in other hubs other than SF. New York is starting to become a big one. I think Texas probably will become similar. And I don't know. I feel like for myself, I don't have to deal with earthquakes, which is why I'm not trying to move to California. But I'm sure there's a mixture of reasons. I recently was watching this like video interview, and they're basically talking about how people who are living in SF don't really have a lot of like social life. It's really just like people who are there to build companies. So it could also just be that, SF has kind of been saturated with just tech people, and there's potential to build a tech hub somewhere else that has a different culture, which I'm sure is appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at like just at a logical level, like California has always been expensive. It's always getting more expensive. And like we've seen movements to like make new tech hubs as just like a general idea. Like Miami became or is trying to become like a big crypto hub, but a lot of that's still in SF and New York. Seattle was obviously born because obviously tech companies have been there, but that's kind of growing in like younger, like technology folks wanting to be there instead of California because the prices are much more reasonable. It just feels to me like Austin, Houston, et cetera, have just kind of opened up as like more valid locations for that, especially as like, again, you go where the companies are. Austin, Houston, I assume have not become like as insanely expensive as SF is generally. And so for people who are like, they want a young tech culture, they want to be able to like be surrounded by people building, not necessarily companies, but just like folks who are like in engineering or folks who are in software. I mean, of course, like rockets and such are now there. It just makes sense that you kind of end up there and like put some index on that. When it becomes too expensive as a result of that migration, obviously will lead to a different lens of conversation. But I ain't going too hot.
I think that there's probably also another underlying phenomenon happening here, in that companies now have higher probability of success building in disparate parts, meaning that the kind of introduction of the video calls that we're on right now has made it easier for people to work in preferred destinations, and they simply don't have to be located in California, whether it be San Francisco or otherwise, in order to build great companies. There used to be a much larger delta in your probability of success if you were building in San Francisco versus if you were building in Texas or North Carolina or New York or Florida or Illinois or somewhere else, Seattle, Washington. And so I just think that with the ability to kind of remote work in from anywhere, there's just now less pressure for the companies with the largest ambitions to be built out of Silicon Valley, as an example. I still think you're going to get the highest density of, unicorns and et cetera coming out of Silicon Valley, but that density is going to be dispersed to places like Austin and otherwise. And yeah, some people are going to leave because of increasing prices. Some people are going to leave because they prefer the politics of one area versus the other. Some people, like Lakshay just noted, are going to move because they prefer the weather in one location versus another. And I think that just the burgeoning of technologies, the growing influence of disparate teams, this idea of remote work, this idea that you can build more things with fewer people, now that AI is kind of really coming into the scene, I think it just leads to proliferation of companies elsewhere that kind of wasn't previously possible.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I'll speak to Austin, and I'm curious, Kavin, maybe Lakshay, if you guys have takes on the culture in New York. I think in Austin, the vibe is very tech forward now. It feels very informal in the way that my feel of other places feels much more formal. At least in my feel of New York it feels more corporate and finance oriented, whereas Austin feels more kind of pure tech oriented and very kind of indie hacker style. It feels like a lot of solo dev, small team, very kind of on the ground organic. And I think that culture is really attractive to a lot of builders, especially in their 20s and 30s. Housing is not that expensive still in Austin, despite it's gone up a lot. My friends in Austin have been kind of taken aback by how quickly the housing market has changed in Austin over the last 10 years. We've had friends who've been there for 20 plus years, and housing is much harder to get now than it was 10 years ago, but it's still much more affordable than San Francisco, or I would guess kind of suburbs near New York City. What's the vibe like for builders in New York City?
So it's funny that you mentioned the housing market prices going up. I feel like actually I read something recently where in New York, there were more vacancies this year than there have been for a very long time. And apparently like there are apartments that usually go for like 2 million. Now they're like 1.2 million. But I do think that AI is picking up in New York. Definitely like a lot more startups, a lot more VCs, I think, just understanding that there's a lot of AI talent, I think, on the East Coast. I've always enjoyed more of the suburbs. I think that I'm someone who I like to see green fields and trees. So I think I think going back to Damon's point, where before you kind of had to sacrifice where you wanted to live in order to have a better chance of succeeding at work. Now it's very much like you can kind of keep them independent, pick where the work environment you like best, and I think that also is better for the companies as well, because if your employees are working out of a place where they feel comfortable and they're enjoying life outside of work the best, then I think that's going to translate to the work they kind of bring in.
I think also, just to touch on the housing point specifically, this is far beyond my expertise, but just as I read the tea leaves from the news and otherwise, I think Austin has done some fairly clever things in terms of housing permits and zoning that have helped them kind of keep the supply of houses, as I understand it, slightly better than places like San Francisco or New York. And I do wonder if some of that, increased cost of living in the form of home prices could be alleviated or kind of worked around by simple restructuring of the ways in which people can build homes, can build, kind of small, not just single family homes, but, either condos, townhomes, apartment buildings, that kind of thing. And so I think there's some, interesting insights that can be gleaned from Austin as a test case for some of those things.
This is kind of changing gears a bit. I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on this, but so Trump kind of got in JD Vance as his VP, who used to be in venture capital. And I know a lot of people in Silicon Valley love that. I guess, what are y'all's thoughts on kind of someone with that tech background? I don't know if we've ever seen someone either going for president or vice president having that kind of a tech background. Just curious on your guys' thoughts.
I was almost worried we weren't going to talk about politics given the time. I'll let others go first. I want to hear what everyone has to say as someone who I did not know JD Vance was VC first. That's interesting. If others knew that, by all means, talk about it. But
I've got a couple thoughts. I mean, number one, I do think that you've articulated the point well, and that JD Vance is unlike other candidates that we've seen. My history isn't quite good enough to be able to comment directly on if it is if there's singular uniqueness there, or if it is just simply that it hasn't been for a while. I think in either case, the point still remains. Candidly, I'm not the biggest fan of JD Vance, but I do think that he provides an interesting and different perspective that, given the importance of technology, specifically software, specifically in the world of AI, I think it's important for America to be a leader in that. And so I think there's some good things on the general ethos of having somebody with business savvy, somebody with tech experience in positions of leadership. I'll also say that one of the largest challenges that I think we and other nations across the world are facing is this idea of fiscal balance, right? Running up the national deficit without a kind of a direct means to get out from under that. It does feel to me like it needs some level of rational business expertise, kind of in a simple balancing of the checkbooks to be able to kind of look at that. If JD Vance is that person or not, I don't really know, truthfully. And again, I'm kind of less, I look upon JD Vance less favorably than I think a lot of counterparts in the business world might. But with respect to, is his perspective valuable? I think the short answer to that is yes. Also, just as a quick tangent on this topic, one of the things I've been following very closely as we've seen kind of this natural or maybe even unnatural just turbulence in this election cycle is Polymarket. And I just kind of want to bring that up is like, I think it's fascinating to watch human psychology play out in the terms of betting markets. And like we've talked about betting a little bit on this channel, and like I'm in no ways advocating for betting on sports, politics, or anything else. But I do think that in general, where we have seen political polls in the past not be indicative of people's true responses, what ultimately tends to be pretty close to people's true feelings is the way in which they spend their money. And so I have found it interesting to track, for example, election probability results, Trump versus Biden, Trump versus Kamala, those kind of things adjust in real time on these types of like secondary markets that allow people to bet in real time. So sorry for the tangent, but Shashi, go ahead and kind of go back to JD Vance.
I think it's great for the tech community to have somebody who's lived and worked in tech. So I think that's a real positive. I believe he worked for Peter Thiel, perhaps at Founders Fund, in terms of his background. Damon's nodding, so I think that's confirmed. So Peter Thiel is world class as an entrepreneur and investor. So if he worked for Peter Thiel for 5 years, I have no doubt that JD Vance is capable and smart, regardless of what you think of his political preferences. I think having for me the top criteria for selecting candidates is how they help our country compete on the world stage. Where I think a lot of voters end up narrowly focused is in seeing the election as zero sum. And taking the global context out of the equation. And for me, that's forefront. So how we compete, how the United States competes with China and other countries on the world stage is the single biggest criteria. And if any candidate, JD Vance or otherwise, helps us do that well, then I'm all for it. And technology plays a big role in global competitiveness, undoubtedly. As an example, Anduril is probably one of the most important companies in the world for the United States because it gives the United States a warfighting capacity that may be distinct and unique from any other country because of technological investment and advance. So that's my high level view on kind of any kind of candidate and what they have to offer. But if JD Vance worked for Peter Thiel for 5 years, I would assume he's very, very smart and very well adept at technology and the finance of technology.
I think like another interesting point is, go ahead.
And this is just a poke to the strategy. Did you see, so Andreessen Horowitz, they put out a video, like a 40-minute, I think like 44 or 5-minute, kind of just like their look on the election. This was before Kamala ended up getting the nomination, but it was kind of just like a discussion on Trump, Biden, the two parties, and like it was a very, very, at least for me, like a very, very helpful view of like, as a technologist, like how you should be kind of like looking at the world and that way kind of looking at the election. And there's a really like interesting kind of just like structuring of just like look at a political or not even political, look at the state of affairs of the nation as a combination between technology, government, and military, right? There's a cycle in there that like your innovation has to feed into the military. Your military obviously leads to impact of like how much global control and power you have over industry. That of course is driven by your government, how much they're indexing on that. And there was a lot of like really interesting discussion to me, obviously being a very liberal person, like very plainly, like from the West Coast, from Portland, what else would I be? It was very interesting, like looking at it that way and recognizing a lot of the discussion that they were talking about with like, what are the policies of like the Trump ticket generally? What are the policies of like the Democratic ticket as they currently exist? And looking at stuff that has not yet been enacted, but is stuff that's on like the Democratic ticket that is very anti-innovation. That's like a lot of stuff that's like startup killing, that they bring up like the tax and the way that like unrealized capital gains would be realized if you're a startup or investor, like where would VC money go? And if that were to happen, then where is innovation capital going? why people do innovation to begin with, that sort of thing. That was really interesting. I don't know if you saw it, but for me, it was very perspective altering.
Yeah, I was gonna actually, Lakshya's point is really good, because I was gonna say the reason why I brought up JD Vance was because so far over like the last year, we've had like Zuck, I think the CEO of Snapchat, these other types of like social media kind of founders having to come into Congress and basically give a testament about how like social media could hurt kids. And so that, coupled with I think recently there were a couple of congressmen who sent a letter to Sam Altman saying like, hey, how are you gonna make AI more safe, or we don't think you're doing enough for safety. So interesting enough, there's been like this pattern where the government's starting to like catch wind, I guess, almost, to start to learn more and more about AI and be concerned. And so I'm wondering if the Republican kind of strategy is to come off as more tech friendly. Obviously, I think that you definitely need regulation in tech, but maybe it came at a time right before this election cycle where they're trying to potentially use it to their advantage and say, hey, we're actually more tech friendly. And obviously, I think JD Vance's background in tech, I think, kind of speaks to that.
I'll just provide a second to Lakshya's recommendation of that most recent Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz podcast, kind of discussing AI, discussing military and defense, especially as it is relevant to political elections, kind of here and abroad. While I find some of the information in there to be counter to what I kind of believe, I actually think it's incredibly informative, and I think that by and large, Mark and Ben do a very nice job, better than most, at presenting information in a way that allows readers and listeners to kind of make their own determinations. And yes, they will have their opinions sometimes strongly about things, but I think they do a nice job of coloring the context such that listeners can actually get, kind of core informative information out of it versus just kind of, affirmation to a particular point or not. So I do think it is a good and important listen for anybody that is curious about kind of the state of technology and how the results of this election and others may influence kind of the things that are available to entrepreneurs, investors, people in the startup ecosystem at large.
Yeah, I'll just say I think they're both Ben and Mark are very bright, and I believe both have been large donors in the political system. I think both to political left for a long time. And what I'm afraid of is zero-sum thinking in politics, where we're busy trying to divide the pie that we have today rather than expand the pie, especially as it relates to the global stage. And I think that's a really dangerous frame of mind. Regardless of parties, I don't particularly care for either political party, but what I worry about is when zero-sum thinking and dividing the pie becomes more of a focus than our global standing and global growth, which is necessary for the whole country to kind of continue to be the global superpower. And I think the conclusion they reached, which was the democratic policies, feel like they come from a good place, but are ultimately undermining of the American experience, are where I land also in my analysis, which is it doesn't focus on where we all grow together. And I'll just say, since we haven't on this pod yet talked about Trump getting shot, I think there was something really important there that felt like an American moment for a lot of people in this country. And it felt like a unifying American moment for a lot of people. And I'll just add to that had Trump gotten killed in that shooting, I think we would be in a deeply uncertain place as a country. I think we would even be potentially on the brink of a civil war because of that kind of change in how a lot of people in this country view our government and distrust our government. And so I think it's by some miracle that he didn't get killed, that we aren't kind of plunged into deep civil unrest. But I think had he been killed, I think we probably would have a material risk of civil unrest. Ray Dalio wrote about this recently on a post on LinkedIn. And he has an article, a regular post that he does on LinkedIn, and he wrote about the potential for civil war in the United States should Trump have gotten killed, which continues to exist if Trump doesn't get elected. I think if Trump loses an election, it will be seen as some kind of a subterfuge, some kind of subverting of democracy that would again put the United States at risk of some kind of important civil unrest and another potential civil war.
Sashi, when you mentioned, the U.S. trying to compete on a global level, so Zuck, when he released Llama, he kind of also mentioned that they wanted to release it open source, basically talking about how they felt like that was the best way to even protect it from, potential other competitors like in China and elsewhere in the world, and that keeping it basically open source would kind of help that type of distribution into smaller models and help other researchers basically improve the model. What are your thoughts, I guess, on AI being open source and like how that relates to like globalization? Like, do you think that US AI companies, not obviously everything being open source, but like certain aspects of it being open source, like do you think that does help out America more, or it's more of like a safeguard against maybe other agents from other countries?
I think ultimately what America has that other countries don't have is a level of trust. And an open model creates more trust and I think that works better in the long run for certain use cases than an entirely closed model. So I think it's important to have a really capable open source model. It doesn't need to be the only model. There can be really great closed source models, but I think it's important that there is one that is a competitor in that race, at least one, and I'm going to talk about Mistral as well, that are open models of different sizes, including on cell phone, at the edge kind of computing as well. There are going to be so many AI use cases, and having an alternative that's open makes a difference. And coming from a big American tech company, Llama coming from Facebook or coming from Meta makes a difference because it adds a certain level of legitimacy.
Awesome. Well, great. Kavin, thanks for joining us today. We are at time, and so we'll pick up some of these conversations on some upcoming episodes. The political, kind of information cycle, news cycle is only going to pick up over the rest of the year. So I'm sure this will be one of many discussions. We'll be able to kind of dig into the weeds on that, including the kind of influence that AI may or may not have in that race. So thanks everyone for joining this episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Find us at our YouTube channel, and remember to subscribe and leave your comments in the sections below. Thanks, and see you next time.